Something is happening to the American dollar that most people cannot see. But the evidence is piling up in ways that should concern anyone paying attention to global finance. The vital signs are deteriorating month by month, and the monitors are flashing warnings that central bankers and treasury officials would rather not discuss publicly. The petrodollar system that has sustained American economic dominance for half a century is now lying on an operating table, and the prognosis does not look encouraging. Consider what the data from the past 12 months actually reveals about the state of this patient. The United States government spent $970 billion on net interest payments during fiscal year 2025, nearly triple the $345 billion it paid when the pandemic began in 2020. That figure comes directly from Treasury Department records, and it represents money that flows out before a single soldier gets paid or a single road gets repaired. The national debt itself has swollen to $38.4 trillion as of December 2025, increasing by roughly $6 billion every single day, according to the Joint Economic Committee. At the current trajectory, the country will cross $39 trillion before spring arrives in 2026. Meanwhile, the nations that have traditionally propped up this system by purchasing American debt are quietly heading toward the exits. Central banks around the world added over 1,000 tons of gold to their reserves in each of the past 3 years, a sustained buying spree not seen since the 1960s. China has maintained 11 consecutive months of purchases, despite already holding over 2,300 tons officially, and analysts believe the true stockpile could exceed 5,000 tons based on discrepancies between reported data and actual gold flows into Shanghai. The BRICS alliance now encompasses roughly 48% of the global population after expanding to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and Indonesia. In October 2025, the bloc launched a pilot settlement instrument called the Unit that allows member nations to conduct wholesale trade without touching dollars. Russia and China already settle 99% of their bilateral commerce in local currencies, representing over $240 billion annually that bypasses the American banking system entirely. Saudi Arabia, the nation whose 1974 agreement to price oil exclusively in dollars created this entire system, has officially stated it remains open to accepting yuan, euros, or other currencies for petroleum sales. The Saudi Central Bank joined Project Enbridge in June 2024, a digital currency platform that enables cross-border payments outside traditional dollar infrastructure. The patient is not dead, and predictions of imminent collapse have proven wrong many times before, though the dollar still accounts for roughly 58% of global foreign exchange reserves. And nearly 90% of all currency transactions worldwide still involve the greenback. But the trajectory matters more than the current snapshot. And every indicator points in a direction that should concern anyone who has built their financial life around the assumption that American monetary dominance will continue indefinitely. The question is no longer whether the petrodollar system faces serious challenges, but rather how quickly those challenges will translate into consequences that ordinary people can feel. The heart, how the system pumped blood to understand why the petrodollar is dying. You first need to understand how it came alive in the first place. Every autopsy begins with examining the anatomy of the patient. And the anatomy of American financial dominance traces back to the summer of 1974, when Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Saudi Arabia, carrying instructions that would reshape the global economy for the next 5 decades, as the country was hemorrhaging at that moment in history. President Nixon had abandoned the gold standard 3 years earlier, announcing that dollars could no longer be redeemed for a fixed amount of bullion sitting in Fort Knox. Washington had printed far too much currency to finance the Vietnam War and ambitious domestic programs. And foreign central banks had begun exchanging their paper for the metal it supposedly represented. Nixon pulled the plug rather than watch the gold reserves drain completely, and the currency went into freefall as a consequence. The Arab oil embargo of 1973 made everything worse, sending gasoline prices skyward and creating lines that stretched for blocks at filling stations nationwide. Citizens were brawling at gas pumps while inflation devoured their purchasing power and equity. Markets shed nearly half their value over 18 months. The economic picture looked genuinely catastrophic, and the greenback appeared headed toward irrelevance on the world stage. Simon landed in Jeddah with a proposition designed to rescue the dollar while offering the Saudi monarchy something equally valuable in return. The arrangement contained three interlocking elements that would form the beating heart of what we now call the petrodollar system. The first element guaranteed military protection for the House of Saud. Washington would supply advanced weaponry and pledge to defend the kingdom against any regional adversary, whether revolutionary movements or hostile neighbors. The second element required Riyadh to leverage its dominant position in OPEC, so that crude oil sold anywhere on the planet would be priced exclusively in American currency. If Germany wanted petroleum from the Gulf, they needed greenbacks first. If Tokyo required energy imports, they had to accumulate dollars before placing an order. The third element completed the circuit with elegant simplicity. The Saudis would channel their enormous petroleum revenues directly into treasury bonds, effectively lending those dollars right back to Washington. The royal family received steady interest payments and a secure vault for their national wealth, while the federal government gained a reliable purchaser for its debt and a mechanism that compelled every oil-importing nation on Earth to stockpile its currency. This architecture allowed Washington to run deficits that would have destroyed any other nation's monetary credibility. The planet needed dollars to purchase energy, creating perpetual demand regardless of how aggressively the printing presses operated or how deeply the government borrowed. The petrodollar system functioned smoothly for decades because it operated like neutral infrastructure, similar to how a water utility delivers service without caring about the political opinions of its customers. Nations could disagree with Washington on countless issues while still using the dollar system to conduct trade, hold reserves, and settle international transactions. This neutrality was essential to the arrangement because it gave every country confidence that their dollar-denominated wealth would remain accessible regardless of diplomatic tensions. Then the United States did something that shattered this confidence permanently. In February 2022, Russian tanks rolled across the Ukrainian border, and the Western response transformed the global financial architecture in ways that continue reverberating through central banks and finance ministries around the world. Within days of the invasion, Washington and its European allies executed a financial strike that stunned even seasoned observers with its speed and coordination. They froze approximately $300 billion in Russian central bank reserves held in Western institutions, wealth that Moscow had accumulated over decades through energy exports and careful financial management. The Russian government had believed these reserves were untouchable precisely because they sat in the safest financial institutions on the planet. Instead, those funds became hostages overnight, locked away through coordinated legal actions that transformed sovereign savings into stranded capital. The bulk of these immobilized assets now sit at Euroclear in Belgium, generating interest that gets redirected toward Ukrainian defense efforts rather than returning to Moscow. Russian emergency reserves are literally financing weapons used against Russian soldiers on the battlefield, a humiliation that every finance minister in the developing world has studied with intense focus. This was the autoimmune response that began killing the petrodollar from within. The United States used its own financial infrastructure as a weapon, and in doing so, it demonstrated to every nation on Earth that dollar-denominated assets exist only at the pleasure of Washington. The permission to access your own wealth can be revoked whenever American policymakers decide you have crossed some geopolitical boundary. Chinese officials watched this unfold and immediately recognized the implications for their own situation. Beijing holds hundreds of billions in American treasury securities and maintains enormous dollar reserves that could vanish with a keystroke if tensions over Taiwan or the South China Sea escalate beyond some invisible threshold. The same calculation now runs through the minds of policymakers in Riyadh, New Delhi, Brasilia, and dozens of other capitals that previously considered dollar reserves to be perfectly safe. The system attacked itself, and the damage cannot be undone through diplomacy or reassurance. Once a weapon has been fired, everyone knows it can be fired again. When Washington froze Russian reserves and cut major Russian banks off from the SWIFT messaging network, the expectation was economic asphyxiation, without access to the financial plumbing that connects banks worldwide. Russia would be unable to conduct international transactions, and its economy would supposedly crater within weeks. Western officials celebrated what they believed would be swift financial destruction of the Russian state. That prediction collapsed embarrassingly. And the reason it failed reveals how the petrodollar patient is losing its monopoly on the global financial airway. Russia survived because alternative payment channels already existed and could be expanded rapidly once the traditional routes were severed. The first backup system is called SPFs, Russia's domestic equivalent to SWIFT, that began development in 2014 following sanctions over Crimea. When the heavier restrictions landed in 2022, this network was ready to handle internal banking communications and connect with foreign partners willing to work outside Western frameworks. The Chinese alternative matters far more for the long-term prognosis, called CIPS. The cross-border interbank payment system launched in 2015 and has grown into a genuine, parallel infrastructure for yuan-denominated transactions. In 2024, the network processed 175 trillion yuan worth of payments, equivalent to roughly $24 trillion and representing 43% growth from the previous. As of mid-2025, approximately 1,500 financial institutions across 121 countries participate in the system, which connects to nearly 4,800 banks spanning 185 nations worldwide. Russia and China wired their respective networks together, establishing a financial corridor that functions entirely beyond Western visibility. Bilateral commerce between the two countries exceeded $240 billion in 2024, with Russian officials claiming that 99% now settles in rubles and yuan. Energy, agricultural products, and manufactured goods flow between these economies without American banks processing a single transaction or gaining any insight into the trade flows. Project Enbridge pushes this evolution further still, coordinated by the Bank for International Settlements with participation from the central banks of China, Thailand, the UAE, Hong Kong, and Saudi Arabia. This digital currency platform enables near-instantaneous cross-border settlements. Transactions that previously required multiple correspondent banks and several business days can now clear in seconds, through direct connections between monetary authorities. The critical caveat is that roughly 80% of CIP's transactions still rely on SWIFT for messaging, and the dollar remains dominant in global payments at nearly 50%. But the infrastructure for breathing without American oxygen now exists and expands with each passing quarter. The liver removes toxins from the bloodstream. And for nations seeking independence from American financial leverage, the dollar has increasingly become something that needs to be filtered out of their economic systems. Nowhere is this detoxification process more consequential than in the evolving relationship between Saudi Arabia and China. The two nations whose original partnership created the petrodollar and whose shifting alliance may ultimately destroy it. China purchases roughly 1.6 million barrels of Saudi crude every single day, making it the kingdom's most important petroleum customer, even though Russia has now surpassed Saudi Arabia as China's largest overall supplier. For 5 decades, every barrel of that Saudi oil was priced and settled in American currency, forcing China to maintain enormous dollar reserves and routing every transaction through financial infrastructure that Washington could monitor or freeze at will. That arrangement is now being quietly renegotiated. At the World Economic Forum in Davos during January 2023, Saudi Finance Minister Mohammed Al-Jadaan made a statement that would have been unthinkable a decade earlier. Asked about currency arrangements for oil sales, confirmed that the kingdom was open to settling trade in currencies other than the dollar, including the euro, the yuan, or even the Saudi rial itself. This was not an offhand remark from a minor official, but a deliberate signal from someone speaking for the Crown Prince. The infrastructure to execute this shift already exists. The Shanghai International Energy Exchange launched yuan-denominated crude oil futures contracts back in 2018, establishing a pricing mechanism that competes directly with the dollar-based benchmarks in London and New York. More significantly, these contracts include a feature that addresses the primary objection oil exporters have always raised about accepting yuan. The currency cannot be freely converted or spent outside China the way dollars can. The workaround centers on gold conversion through the Shanghai Exchange. Sellers who receive yuan for their petroleum can immediately convert those funds into physical bullion, then transport the metal to their own vaults, anywhere in the world. This mechanism transforms oil sales into gold accumulation without the yuan ever needing to leave Chinese territory or function as a long-term store of value. The seller receives a universally recognized asset that cannot be frozen by any government, while China secures energy priced in its own currency. Saudi Arabia joined Project Enbridge in June 2024, gaining direct access to digital payment rails that bypass dollar infrastructure entirely. Reports from late 2025 suggest discussions about establishing Shanghai gold exchange vaults on Saudi territory, which would streamline this oil-for-gold conversion without requiring physical shipment across continents. The liver is learning to filter more efficiently with each passing month. The kidneys filter waste products from the body, and when they fail, toxins accumulate until the entire system begins shutting down. The American financial system now carries a level of debt that functions like chronic kidney disease, slowly poisoning the organism from within while requiring ever more aggressive interventions just to maintain basic function. The numbers have reached a scale that defies meaningful comprehension. As of December 2025, the United States federal government owes $38.4 trillion to its creditors, a figure that increases by approximately $6 billion every single day, according to the Joint Economic Committee. At that velocity, the debt will cross $39 trillion by March 2026 and could approach $40 trillion before autumn arrives. These are not projections from pessimistic analysts, but simple arithmetic based on current spending trajectories. The interest payments required to service this mountain of obligations have become genuinely alarming. During fiscal year 2025, the federal government spent $970 billion just on net interest, nearly triple the $345 billion it paid 5 years earlier when the pandemic began. That single line item now exceeds spending on national defense and ranks. As the third largest category in the entire federal budget, behind only Social Security and Medicare, the Congressional Budget Office projects interest costs will reach $1.8 trillion annually by 2035, at which point debt service will consume more resources than healthcare for seniors. This dynamic creates a spiral that becomes increasingly difficult to escape. The government borrows money to cover its deficit, which adds to the principal, which increases the interest payments, which expands the deficit further, which requires additional borrowing. Each revolution of this cycle makes the next one worse, and the mathematics eventually become impossible, regardless of political will or economic growth. The traditional escape valve for this kind of debt accumulation has always been the petrodollar system itself, because the world needed dollars to purchase energy, where foreign nations accumulated American currency and parked it in treasury bonds, which effectively lending money to Washington at artificially suppressed rates. China, Japan, Saudi Arabia, and dozens of other countries subsidized American borrowing for decades because holding dollars served their own economic interests. That subsidy is now evaporating as the trends described in previous chapters accelerate. Foreign central banks are diversifying into gold rather than treasuries, accumulating over 1,000 tons annually for 3 consecutive years. China has reduced its treasury holdings from a peak above $1.3 trillion down to roughly $689 billion as of late 2025. The buyers who once absorbed American debt without question are now actively seeking alternatives. When a patient needs a transfusion, doctors select blood because nothing else carries what the body requires. Gold has served this function in finance since ancient civilizations first recognized its unique properties. Carrying value across borders without requiring trust in any government, what the world is witnessing now is central banks draining paper dollars from their reserves and replacing them with physical metal at a pace not seen since the 1960s. The numbers tell the story clearly. Central banks purchased over 1,000 tons of gold in each of the past 3 years, with China, Poland, Turkey, and India leading the accumulation. China officially holds over 2,300 tons, though analysts tracking Shanghai vault flows believe the true figure could exceed 5,000 tons. Gold has surged past $3,600 per ounce as institutional demand collides with relatively fixed supply, and central bank purchases now absorb roughly 25% of annual mine output. This metallic shift runs parallel to the institutional rewiring happening through the BRICS alliance. The bloc now encompasses 48% of global population after adding Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and Indonesia. In October 2025, members launched a pilot settlement instrument called the Unit for Wholesale Trade outside dollar channels. Russia and China already conduct 99% of their bilateral commerce in local currencies. Yet the revolution has clear limits that deserve acknowledgement. The dollar still represents 58% of global reserves and dominates nearly 90% of foreign exchange transactions. India has publicly distanced itself from de-dollarization rhetoric. And the July 2025 BRICS summit in Rio produced no concrete progress toward a shared currency. The patient is sick, but predictions of imminent death have proven premature before. And the institutions building alternatives still rely heavily on the infrastructure they claim to be replacing. The prognosis, what comes next, the patient will survive. But the recovery will fundamentally alter how the global economy operates. Like a heart attack survivor learning to live with reduced capacity, the United States must adapt to a world where its monetary dominance exists alongside viable alternatives rather than maintaining absolute control. The timeline matters more than dramatic predictions. Over the next 2 to 3 years, expect gradual diversification to accelerate while the dollar retains its dominant position. Central banks will continue accumulating gold. BRICS nations will expand their alternative payment systems. And energy transactions will increasingly settle in local currencies. The dollar's share of global reserves may decline from 58% to roughly 50%. But this erosion will feel manageable rather than catastrophic. The critical inflection point arrives within 5 to 7 years, when alternative systems begin handling 20 to 30% of global trade. At this threshold, network effects reverse, and adoption of non-dollar systems accelerates exponentially. Saudi Arabia and China may formalize their yuan-foral arrangements. The BRICS unit could expand beyond pilot programs, and Project Enbridge might connect dozens of central banks directly. Beyond the 10-year horizon, 3 scenarios appear most plausible. The managed decline scenario sees the dollar retaining reserve currency status while losing its monopoly position. Similar to how the British pound transitioned after World War II, the crisis acceleration scenario involves a geopolitical shock, perhaps over Taiwan or Iran, that forces rapid adoption of existing alternatives. The hybrid system scenario produces regional currency blocks where the yuan dominates Asia. The euro serves Europe and Africa, and the dollar maintains influence in the Americas. For investors and institutions, this transition creates both risks and opportunities that require immediate attention. Diversifying beyond dollar-denominated assets becomes essential. With particular focus on gold, real estate, and carefully selected foreign currencies, emerging markets may benefit disproportionately as capital flows redistribute away from traditional Western financial centers. Energy and commodity producers gain pricing power as competition between currency systems intensifies. The American economy will not collapse, but it will operate differently. Higher borrowing costs will constrain fiscal spending, forcing more disciplined budget choices. Import prices may rise as the dollar loses some purchasing power premium, while export competitiveness improves. Financial services, currently a major economic pillar, will face increased competition from alternative systems. The petrodollar's slow death does not herald American decline so much as global rebalancing. The system that emerged from 1970s crisis served its purpose for 5 decades. But the world has outgrown the need for a single nation's currency to function as global infrastructure. What comes next will be messier and more complex, but potentially more stable once the transition completes. The patient will survive, transformed.